Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Thursday morning's members podcast. I'm Chloe Tetro. I'm the health coach here with Ready Care. And for today, the topic that we will be looking at is the problem with all or nothing. So, for those that were tuned in 2 weeks ago for the overview on managing slip ups, glossed over a little bit about cognitive distortions and how those can affect our ability to reach our goals. A few of them were mentioned, and all or nothing came up. And as it's something that I'm seeing very, very frequently with clients and across the spectrum, with some difficulties people can face when they are undergoing a behavioral and lifestyle change, it's something that I felt might be a good thing to get into a little bit more today. So, all or nothing is a descriptive that a lot of people would use when they talk about themselves. It is often worn as a badge of honor. And we might have heard it with our friends, our family, our co-workers, that attitude of, I'm a very all or nothing person. And oftentimes when people utilize that turn of phrase, they very seldomly place themselves in the nothing. In the nothing, they're usually on the all when they describe themselves that way. But really, the reality of all or nothing um, would be described as what's called a cognitive distortion. And what a cognitive distortion is, it's a thought pattern that makes us more prone towards negative thoughts, conclusions about ourselves and others, and can be quite extreme and polarized way of thinking, especially with all or nothing, which is also called black and white thinking, polarized thinking, dichotomized thinking, all of those types of ways that would push one extreme and the other. So very little room for middle ground. And oftentimes when people call themselves all or nothing people, at least there's a degree of self-awareness, so that's pretty good. But more often than not, that type of thinking goes on very much in the background. It's something that we're not particularly aware of. It's something that's running below script, and that can show up in ways that very, very much get in the way of our goals, our progress, and our ability to manage anything that might be thrown at us that's a little bit of a curveball. So implicit in the name all or nothing is a perfectionist streak. You know, the dichotomy is often perfection or failure. And that can take many guises. It can take the guise of, let's say, somebody being extremely on it or not on it whatsoever. It can be very responsible behavior, very irresponsible behavior, anything that kind of pushes us to those extremes. But within the perfectionism piece, there is that kind of unwillingness to look at the fact that it is a kind of zero-sum game, that to begin with, striving for that perfection piece is setting yourself up for massive, massive disappointment and going to get in the way of how you approach obstacles as they come up, because they inevitably do. It's part of any journey, whatever that might be, any new endeavor, is the challenge. And the challenge as it comes up, when somebody is very, very much locked into that perfection, the all or nothing can be an extremely, extremely difficult road to come back from. So let's have a quick look at what the all or thinking pattern really is, in terms of it's one of the main aspects that can be problematic in a work setting, in a self setting. Societal and political actually is one of the ways that we can really see it in the outside world. Um, the the difficulty with that is the failure piece, is the perfection or failure piece, because as human nature, we very seldomly, if ever, will ever reach the mark in terms of perfection, which pretty much means that somebody with that thought process, especially when it's geared towards themselves, more often than not will very much focus on how it is that they've failed, how it is that they've fallen short of this ideal, how it is that this falling short will tend to translate to thought patterns, emotional patterns, and can very, very quickly become a downward spiral where they set themselves into good, bad space. They've now landed on the bad space with all the behaviors that can come along with that. So when we polarize our behavior in such extreme manners as the good and bad dichotomy, um, we tend to push our behavioral patterns accordingly. So, an example of that could be somebody who begins lifestyle change and have the beautiful motivational drive of the novelty factor in the beginning stages and extremely applied to the process. So, they have all of their notes done, they're planned to a T, they're scheduled, they've all the foods in, they have all of the videos watched, they are extremely on it, but they're kind of getting a little bit exhausted. But that is the pinnacle of this is what it should always be. Um, I mentioned in the last video on the managing slip ups that people have a tendency to judge themselves at the benchmark of the best day that they've had. So, what that means is if you're in the office and you manage to get everything filed, everything done, all your work done by 11:30. You had your lunch, you went back and took on more projects and this, and the other thing, and you've had a great day. That kind of subconsciously becomes the benchmark for what it is we're capable of without the factoring in that that was a fluke, that was the exception, not the rule. So sometimes when we are in those polarized states, the perfection becomes the beginning stages, the part where we were most motivated, had the most novelty factor, and were able to do those things. And then the behaviors that go along with that. So planning, scheduling, getting everything done. Then the nothing side, the bad side, could be our worst experience of ourselves in the opposite of that. So it could be totally out of control. You know, the eating patterns are very out of control. We've not moved for days. There's very little planning. There's very little empowerment around what it is that we want to do. So the behaviors tend to mirror that. So that could be not wanting to get up, being quite down on ourselves, staying on the phone, scrolling for hours, watching TV for hours, and really sinking into that space of feeling bad. I'm the bad version of myself. So when you have those very highly polarized versions of self, and something does come up, the tendency is to fall right back into the behavioral and patterns of the so-called bad or the all or nothing aspect. And how that can become difficult when people are in that space is that when they try to get back on the horse, as it were, the novelty factor is now gone. You already know what it is. Your brain is not going, woo, what's this new fun, exciting thing that we're getting our dopamine hit from? It knows what it is. So oftentimes when people are in that polarized state, when they hit a roadblock and they fall right into the kind of bad behavioral routine, I would say bad here in air quotes, definitely. It can be exceedingly difficult to go back from that. So um, a very, very helpful tool to begin with is to start to recognize whether this is something that you would be prone to do. Now, a way to recognize that first is past experiences. If you have really thrown yourself at something in the beginning stages and saw yourself going right back, and that kind of pendulum swing between things can be a good indicator that that is something that is in your kind of history of pattern behavior. And to be honest, everybody on the face of the planet has this up to a point. It just can show itself in different spectrums of intensity for different people. So if it is something that you are resonating with and have an experience of, it can be very good to start to look at that in terms of the viability of your idea of perfection. And with perfection, like I kind of think of it as like one of the last major mythos, the heroic figure that, always gets their things done, and this kind of exemplary fictional mythological creature that doesn't exist in the realms of men, that we consistently tend to pin our colors to that mast. And really starting to look at, when you begin a task or a goal, you begin an endeavor, whether it be work related, health related, whether it be in your personal life, that you really have a look at what your expectations are. And that's a major, major one, because if your expectations are not on a centered equilibrium from the get-go, you're consistently striving, consistently aiming for the impossible, which is going to place yourself back in the all or nothing, push-pull, pendulum swing over and over and over again. So starting off and really having a very clear idea, and people talk about visualization as one of the major tools when beginning something. And outside of just purely whimsical imagination, let's say, there is something really, really important in that, because if you don't define the end goal, you're absolutely wavering. You're wavering. You have no markers for when you've hit something successfully, and you have no markers for when you deviate. So starting from that position when you begin of what is a balanced outcome, where do I want to be with this? That's not going to stretch myself within or outside of the reach of what I can tolerate sustainably. Um, it's great to, want the idealized version of yourself, but if you have the awareness that that's actually quite counterproductive and that's going to get in your way, looking at what is the spectrum and where can I navigate in the middle pillar. And philosophers have been saying it for since antiquity, is the middle way, the middle pillar. The weighted equilibrium is far more, how would I put it? It's going to lead to a level of consistency and commitment that is far less wavering than swinging between pendulums of good, bad, all or nothing. So the good, bad, and all or nothing can also be exceedingly damaging to your self-confidence in your ability to do things. One of the ways, or many of the ways that it can show up, is we start to apply this way of thinking to not only ourselves, but the people around us, to choices that we have, either or. Like think of like Game of Thrones. In the Game of Thrones, you win or die. There's nothing else. It's this or that. We start to apply that way of thinking to larger moving from self to other, to situation, to choices, to society, to politics, to globalized view. And it's an exceedingly damaging way to view ourselves and others. It can cause very harsh and unfair judgment of self and others, and can really box in our understanding of the world to overly simplistic, unrealistic, confined perspectives, which, when looking to adapt behavior, to have change, to have something that is in flux and in motion, that level of rigidity is absolutely counterproductive. Some of the traits that can come up with perfectionism, which is, intrinsically connected to this way of thinking, is decreased confidence and self-esteem, which would have touched on in that unattainability of sustainable perfection. You will often find yourself in the other end of that spectrum, just by by virtue of being a human being. Less willingness to take risks because of the fear of failure or perceived failure, fear of asking for help, unable to think of solutions or a middle ground, is a massive thing. And where that shows up an awful lot in behavior, lifestyle, and diet choices and changes is unwillingness to participate and engage in looking for that kind of self-compassionate and middle way understanding of if you've had a bad day, 3 days out of 30, you have 27 days out of 30 that you've done some, you've really looked after yourself. You've made a lot of fantastic choices for your health. And on a spectrum, on a graph, that looks absolutely excellent. But unwillingness to look at the positives, unwillingness to look at solutions to problems that could come up, situational problems that could come up, whereby you might be going out with a group of friends for a meal, and in the all or nothing, you go, no, that's it. I'm blowing it all out. I'm going to absolutely go for it. I'm going to order everything that I can't usually. And most of the time, people just end up feeling rubbish after that. Instead of looking for a middle ground of, okay, well, it's a special occasion and I don't want to feel totally deprived. Otherwise, this will become an unsustainable approach to lifestyle and diet. So what can I allow myself? And what will I go, okay, no, that's moderately enough now. I'm happy enough with that. Which ties into the lack of self-compassion piece, where anything that will send us emotionally into a threat response, which is something I would have touched on the managing slip-ups a little bit. Anything that sends us into that emotional downward spiral will stimulate the threat response, will stimulate the amygdala, and will be stored in the brain's negative bias. So historically and evolutionary speaking, we record negative experiences a lot stronger in our brain. So that's a really good way to keep us safe from harm, safe from whether that be, environmental harm, or whether that be, some berries that actually had a terrible effect, or something as simple as that thing that we said gave a very poor social there was a repercussion socially for it. So we store all of those things in more or less the same area, whether it's a social interaction, an emotional reaction, or whether it's a contextual environmental reaction. So all of those things get kind of stored in a similar place. When we begin a downward spiral from having set the sights a little bit too high, unrealistic, and forcing ourselves into the latter end of our polarized thinking, it starts to create associative pathways where we start to associate this new change in behavior, this new change in lifestyle, not with the good that it could have brought us 27 days out of 30, but with how deeply bad we now feel. We could feel ashamed of ourselves. We could feel like failures. We could feel worthless. And unbeknownst to ourselves, that can start to weave itself into how we approach our behavioral and lifestyle changes. And it's very, what's the word? It runs very much below surface, which can be very difficult to pinpoint why we have a resistance. So it's a great thing to have awareness around. When you are looking at the all or nothing cognitive difficulties, a good way to combat it is to start being really, really aware of when it shows up. So actually, I always find this easier when I'm talking to clients of it's sometimes more difficult to recognize things in ourselves. But if you start to tune your ear over the next day or two, listening to other people's conversations, and look out for the words, I always, I never, or he always, he never. Things like everybody, no one, like surely not everybody was kung fu fighting type of thing. Having that real awareness of how intrinsic in people's parlance and language those types of terminologies are, and really, really starting to recognize those, because the more you're able to attune to them in yourself and others, the more you're able to recognize as they come up. And it's, we have an automatic way of thinking. We have shortcuts in our brains that if we've been doing something a certain length of time, it's kind of what we revert to unless we engage that self-reflective piece, activate the prefrontal cortex, and are able to self-reflect on what it is that we're saying. So really fine-tuning examples of when these things show up in conversation is going to let you go, okay, I can see that this is now a bit of a polarized way of thinking that's excluded the grayscale, the spectrum of all the other possibilities, all of the other perspectives that could potentially, and are far more likely to emerge in those situations. Put the thought on trial. More so with yourself than if you're in conversation, but if you know the person, go for it. Put the thought on trial, and like that's what is it that happened? Was it everybody? Was it as absolute as the terminology suggests? Are there other options there? Explore the options. Sometimes the sublime to the ridiculous is actually a really light-hearted way to start to retrain your thought patterns around this. Is think of the most extreme example, something absolutely bonkers, and think of the most banal example, and start to set out the spectrum in between with that. Suddenly you have this great freedom of there being more than two weighted options to approach something. You have multiple pathways and avenues of behavior. You have multiple pathways and avenues of perspectives and abilities to find middle grounds with something, and abilities to cultivate that self-compassion within a lifestyle and behavioral change setting. A key takeaway for this is when you are undertaking anything like lifestyle behavioral change, is look for progress, not perfection. Perfection is perfection. I'd often say to people who are in the workplace, if you remember your first days starting off, when people teach you how to do CVs and interviews, and they'd say a really good one now to say when they say name a weakness is say I'm too much of a perfectionist, because it'd be such a gotcha. But actually, for those people that have been in the workplace and that are just have a bit more experience out there, perfection is or perfectionism, let's say, is a major weakness when undertaking anything action based, and to cultivate good relationships in the team or a family or whatever that social pool may be, where a member has quite a defined perfectionist trait, can be a nightmare. It can be exceedingly difficult. It can cause an awful lot of upset, and it can undervalue all of the work that is very, very positive. So taking that sort of approach to self and our behavioral patterns, with diet, with exercise, with anything that leads us in a direction of health, is look at the progress. Look at the progress that you've made. Look at where you are now compared to where you were when you wished you had started, and hold that perfectionism a little bit looser in your hand. It's great to have aspirations, but as I said, pick an aspiration that is sustainable, fair to you, and the amount of time you have, the amount of energy you have, and give yourself a fighting chance to find that middle way that is sustainable and that is going to lead you towards your goal in a much more daily step-by-step way that doesn't go through the pendulum swings. I'd say, yeah, moderation and progress versus perfection. So that kind of concludes that part with the all or nothing. I would say have no listen with regards to the day ahead. Have a listen to conversations and watch out for yourself, expressing those types of always, never, no one, everybody, and yeah, play around with that. And yeah, that should be a very good starting point. And best of luck with the week ahead. And Andrew will be back next week again for the members broadcast, and we'll chat to you then. Bye.